Hello friends, this is the second lecture on justice, and we have already had one lecture where we have discussed justice as a distributive concept, and in that lecture we have discussed how different criteria can be used for distribution of resources, distribution of goods, distribution of opportunities and so on. Now, some of the criteria that we have discussed like needs or desert, freedom of choice or maximization of utility or to benefit the least disadvantaged sections in the society and so on. One of the contentious issue regarding this whole conception of justice as a distributive concept is that it talks about giving everyone's his or her due. Now, what should be that criteria of giving everyone's his or her due? So, two premise of such process of giving everyone's his or her due is this idea of desert, what we call also merit. So, individuals are responsible for his or her conditions in the life or the entitlements that he or she enjoys. That conditions or entitlement is the result of his or her action, and therefore, if there is inequalities in the society that is based on the individual skill, talent, capability or merit and so on is justified, and the principle for justification of that kind of status or entitlements is this desert. Individual differ in their capability, in their talent and skill, and therefore, the resulting inequality in society is justifiable. So, that is a kind of desert. So, individuals should not have the same level of living and so on, but they should have different entitlements, different property depending upon their different capabilities and so on. The other principle for such process of giving one's dues is the idea of need. So, individual may have different needs. The society should ensure that the distribution of resources is allocated according to the needs of different people, different individuals, different sections of society and so on. So, these two remain one of the fundamental contentious issue in this idea of justice as a distributive concept. Now, today in this lecture what we are going to do is, in the first part we will discuss the procedural and the substantive notion of justice, and we will carry from what we have discussed in this distributive idea of justice. So, because both procedural to some extent is about not the outcome of the procedure, but about following a procedure which itself is just, and the outcome of its implementation is not that important in assessing what is a just theory or what is the correct theory of justice and so on. And then we will discuss the substantial notion of justice, where the procedure are important. So, we must have a just procedure, but also we should be equally concerned about the just outcome. That is the substantial theory of justice which we will discuss. And in the second part of today's lecture, we will discuss John Rawls' theory of justice as fairness, and in the next lecture we will discuss some of the critique to John Rawls' theory of justice, and then we move on to some other topics. Now, procedural theory of justice emphasizes upon following just rule or procedure for ensuring justice. So, the focus or the emphasis of procedural theory of justice, as the name suggests, is about procedure and the rule which should be just. So, to ensure justice, the scholars and theorists will argue that we must have just procedure and just law. The assumption here is that if you have a just theory or procedure for distribution of resources, it will naturally lead to the just outcome without any consideration to different contexts, geographical, historical, social or economic, the theory of justice could be applicable to all contexts universally without any consideration to the specificities of a particular context if we have a just theory. So, the whole discourse on the positivist tradition of law, constitution and so on is based on this fundamental premise of theory or procedure or rules which will lead to just outcome in the society and so on. So, the procedural theory in that sense is emphasizing upon arriving at a just rule or just procedure, and that will lead to the outcome. So, according to this theory, result or outcome should not be the determining factor in devising or conceptualizing or constituting what is just or what is just rule and procedure. So, this theory results or outcome of these procedures are not quite significant. So, the focus, the emphasis would be on the formation or formulation of a just theory and procedure, and if we arrive at this procedure or just theory, then the outcome will automatically be just. So, the outcome or the result should not be the determining factor in formulation of a just theory or procedure. So, whether a theory is just or not, it should not be determined or assessed by the outcome, but on the basis of the procedure or the formulation of theory itself. So, the emphasis in the procedural theory of justice is about the procedure and not necessarily the outcome. So, the procedural theory of justice primarily focus on the individual. So, the assumption in the procedural theory of justice is the individual autonomy and liberty should be always protected, and a state should have very minimum role in interfering with the autonomy and the liberty of the individual, and individual should have maximum choice to make decisions or to develop his or her skill, and if such decisions and skills leads to different outcome, different results, then that society should be just. So, in that sense, in the procedural theory there is no a kind of end result or the end goal which should be applicable to everyone and which should be predetermined. Now, what should be the end and what should be the goal? These theorists will argue that individuals should be left and individual are best to decide. So, the procedural theory primarily focus on the individual autonomy and liberty. It emphasizes on individual as rational being and aware of various choices that is available to them. The state should not interfere in the entitlements of the individual, and the individual are responsible for their own actions and the consequences thereof. So, the premise of this procedural theory of justice is the individual is a rational autonomous agent aware of his or her choices or decisions, and the result or the consequences of that decisions should be also rest with the individual himself, and state should not interfere with this decision making or the opportunity or the choices that is available to the individual. The procedural theory of justice does not particularly focus on the distribution of goods, benefits and services in the society, as is often argued in the distributive conception of justice. So, the idea of procedural theory is to not focus on the distribution or interference with the individual autonomy or liberty, but to provide them the condition or the just condition for maximization of their opportunities, for the development of their talent, and in that way society role or the role of a state is minimal to ensure the implementation of just laws or just procedure. Everyone should operate within the framework of law or just procedure, and while following those just procedure and law, we will discuss it in Nozick, the outcome should not be determined or predetermined by the state. So, Robert Nozick principle of justice is a very good example of this kind of procedural theory of justice. So, he put forwards two principle of justice, which is called historical or end state principle of justice. Now, he pointed out that the past actions and the choices or decisions that individual makes should determine his or her desert or entitlements, and also the distribution, whether state should actually involve in distribution of resources or not, will be determined by the actions of past or the historical actions of individual and the entitlements that he or she achieve. So, let it put it this way, the individual is entitled to maximize his property, to acquire more property, to have more entitlements and so on. Now, while doing so, the individual must be following or must follow certain procedure that is established. So, that is the just way of acquiring the property and so on. If the individual acquire his or her property by following the just procedure established by law or the state, then his acquiring of property or entitlements are just, and state should not interfere with his resources or do not take the responsibility of distribution among those who are less well off and so on. Whereas, if the individual follows certain unjust or foul means for the acquiring of the property, then a state has the responsibility to correct the past mistakes, to redistribution and so on. So, the historical actions or the choices is focusing upon the individual acquiring of the property, and if it is just, state should not interfere. If it is unjust or acquired through foul means, then a state has the responsibility to redistribute those resources. So, in the end state principle, he emphasized that there should be certain goals or objectives to which the distribution pattern should look into, and distribution of goods and benefits should be done accordingly. So, that is the end result principle, which focuses on certain ends and objectives to be achieved. So, Nozick explains how only a just acquisition of property leads to just transfer of property. So, if you remember, in the equality also we have discussed this idea of acquiring property in a just manner, and its transfer to the other individual is just if the holder has acquired his or her property in a just manner. So, the entitlement is not sufficient, but the process of that acquiring that entitlements or the transfer of that entitlements are equally significant. So, Nozick argue that a state should have a minimal role in distribution. For him, distribution is justified only when property is acquired by foul or unjust means. Otherwise, this state should have very minimal role, should not take the responsibility of distribution if the acquiring of property or entitlements by the individual are just, even if it is unequal in the society and so on. So, those inequalities in entitlements or rights are justified if such acquisition are on just principle or by following the just procedure established by law. If there is a fall, if there is unjust method for the acquiring that property, then state has a role to take away that property and involve in the process of redistribution, but otherwise a state should not interfere with the individual entitlements and property. Now, the substantive justice, in contrast to the procedural theory of justice, also equally emphasize on the outcome or the just outcome in the society. So, the procedural theory of justice particularly focuses on following some procedures or rules to ensure justice, but the outcome of such procedure are not that important while assessing a theory of justice. So, the functioning or the assessment of a theory of justice is based on the procedure itself or the rule itself, and it is argued that if a just rule is formulated or just procedure is formulated, then the outcome will necessarily be just. So, we do not have to take into account the outcome to understand a theory of justice, but we have to formulate a theory which is just in itself, then the outcome or the result will be taken care of on its own. So, however, in contrast to that, substantive theory do emphasize equally on how to get just result by applying just procedure. So, the procedure itself is not sufficient, we also need to equally emphasize on the just outcome. So, one of the example that I have used in one of my lecture previously is this idea of applying. So, the premise of this rule that treat everyone equally appears to be just, and it should work everywhere. We should treat everyone equally. Now, if a society is not equal, if society is not equal, then if we apply this just rule of treating everyone equally, may not lead to the just outcome, that is, everyone will not be on the same level or with the same opportunities or with the same entitlements or resources. So, treating everyone equally in an equal society will lead to just outcome, but treating everyone equally in unequal society will not lead to the just outcome. So, therefore, the substantive theory of justice argues about not just a just principle or procedure of justice, but also the just outcome or the just result of that theory. So, emphasize on how to get just result by applying just procedure, like fair allocation of resources, and how a society ought to work in order to achieve and also maintain justice in the society. So, there is in Rawls we will discuss constant need of redistribution. So, in the society there always will be the concentration of wealth or the resources and inequalities. Now, there is a role of a state to devise a mechanism which will constantly redistribute the concentration of wealth and resources, and to ensure that everyone should have maximum equality or maximum opportunity. If such a difference is required, then it should be in the least disadvantaged people. So, these are some of the things which we will discuss. So, the point in substantive theory is not just to have merely a procedure of just distribution or just theory, but also to focus equally on the just outcome, and more so that justice is not merely about formulating a theory or to achieving a justice once and for all, but it is a kind of constant process of maintaining or ensuring justice to everyone, to every generation in the society and so on. So, the substantive theory of justice is about fair distribution of goods, and these goods are like wealth, income, opportunities to all people despite of their differences in social position and economic status. So, those differences should not be determining in the opportunities that is available to individual or the resources that is available to the individual. It equally emphasizes on the fair principles. So, the just procedure of distribution, and its objective is to establish a social system by ensuring fair distribution of goods. Although his theory is regarded as procedural theory of justice, John Rawls' concept of justice as fairness could be also regarded as a substantive theory. Rawls emphasized on equality in the society as a virtue, and the whole purpose of a political order or the state is to ensure that equality is maintained, and to maintain that he developed two theory of justice which we will discuss. So, justice is the fundamental political virtue in the society. However, he argued that any deviation from this principle of equality is justified if that is for the benefit of the least well off section in the society. So, he argued that to ensure substantive justice in the society requires not just the adherence to the principle of equality, but also it sometimes requires certain preferential treatment or some deviation from this principle of equality. Now, those preferential treatment and deviation from this principle of equality is justified only and only when it is in the benefit of the least well off sections in the society and not otherwise. So, he argued that natural talents and social position should be used to make everyone and not just one or few talented or socially economically well off people, but everyone. So, that is the urge for creating a society which is more just or egalitarian, which provide equality to everyone, every single individual or member of that society, and not to few or a selected group of individual. So, natural talents and social positions should be used to make everyone's life better off or for others benefit in society rather than merely benefiting oneself. So, in the libertarian or the procedural theory of justice, we have seen that the individual entitlements is based on his or her choice or decisions that he or she makes previously. And if such decisions or choices lead to different entitlements, those entitlements are just. So, for them the justice is a matter of individual and not of the society. So, the objective should not be to create a kind of condition or justice is not something that is about related to the society, but it is the individual matter, and the purpose for justice is to ensure maximum liberty and freedom and autonomy to the individual to develop his talent and accordingly get differential or unequal entitlements depending upon his or her capabilities and talent. In contrast to that, we see that there is a kind of moral urge for not just ensuring that talent and social position should be used to maximize the benefit or the entitlements of few, but for everyone in the society, and that is something which is moral, which is a normative, a priori kind of approach to this whole question of justice. This we will discuss when we will discuss this idea of justice as fairness in Rawls in the subsequent slides, but here the Rawls can also be then seen as a theorist who also argued for a substantive theory of justice and not merely a procedural theory. However, his emphasis remain about developing or formulating a theory which can be applicable to every society or every context and not to a particular specific context. So, he did emphasize on developing a procedure or a just theory of justice, but his intentions or his objectives was not limited to procedure alone, but to create a society which will be a more egalitarian and equal society. So, the substantive justice is grounded on application of just procedure which intend to produce a substantive outcome or result for everyone in the society. Therefore, substantive justice focuses on just allocation of resources, benefits or burdens. It requires a procedure with an objective to ensure fair and just allocations of resources. It also requires responsible agents like individuals, group of individuals, public institution and state to ensure that justice or the allocation of resources are done in a just and fair manner. Now, we move on to the second part of our lecture today, that is Rawls' conception of justice as fairness. Rawls in his book A Theory of Justice conceptualized theory of justice as fairness. Now, this idea of justice as fairness is based on the basic tenets of the procedural theory of justice. So, as I was saying, the Rawls' concern was to arrive at a theory of justice which will lead to substantive outcome to create a society which will be more just, more egalitarian, which will provide maximum autonomy and freedom to every individual in that society. So, to create that kind of society, to provide that kind of opportunity to every single member of the society, Rawls conceptualized this theory as fairness, which equally emphasize upon the end results or outcome to create an egalitarian and just society. The premise of his theory is that a human being as a rational moral agent, and both these points are very significant in his conceptualization of justice, that the individual which is rational but also a moral individual, and this moral individual will also have a sense of justice which is innate. So, even we will discuss it in the veil of ignorance, the individual being by nature is rational and also a moral agent, that is the base or the premise on which he or she develops some moral or normative judgments and course of action. So, the premise for this theory of justice as fairness is based on the idea of human being as rational or moral agent, therefore, would choose a principle of justice that would be inconsistent with the distributive theory of justice. So, Rawls talks about the distribution of primary goods. So, here he tries to combine a procedural and the substantive theory of justice, and also the idea of individual as the autonomous, rational, moral being on the one hand, but also that individual is the part of the larger society or the larger community, and therefore, he has some obligation, some responsibility towards this idea of distribution of some resources. So, thus the main focus of his theory is distribution of the benefits, or what he calls primary goods. So, in Rawls we need to understand, while he is arguing for the distribution of the primary goods, he is not arguing for conceptualizing and defining what is good for the individual. Now, for what is good and what is desirable, what one should aspire to become, should be left with the individual to decide or to make decision about. But certain primary goods or resources must be made available to everyone in the society, and therefore, the distribution of resources in Rawls is about the primary good, not about the good conception or what is good for the individual, that should be left. So, there is a kind of a balancing act between this state taking the responsibility of not just providing, but also determining what is good for the individual on the one hand in the kind of authoritarian totalitarian state, and on the other hand the absolute minimalist state without any consideration to the responsibility of distribution or redistribution and so on. So, the Rawls is trying to balance between these two extremes of leaving individual to his or her fate and to interfering in the every sphere of individual life. So, Rawls' theory of distributive conception of justice is about distribution of goods, not about conceptualizing or determining what is good for every individual in the society. So, individual has the autonomy in determining what is good for him or her, but state has a role to ensure that the primary goods or the resources are available to every member in the society. What are those primary goods according to Rawls is that liberty, the maximum liberty should be made available to everyone, then the opportunity which should not be limited to few or the selected groups, but to everyone, income, wealth, self-respect, and not having any scope for envy. So, to create a just society, it is necessary that the entitlements or the acquisition of property or the status of individual is not envied by the others. It can only be done when such acquisition, such status is seen as just by others or everyone in the society. So, there they will cherish and not envy the others status or others entitlements or property and so on. So, these primary goods like liberty, opportunity, income, wealth, self-respect, and not having any scope for envy is something which should be distributed to everyone. So, Rawls argues that these goods should be distributed equally among all the members of the society. However, any deviation in the sense of making some preferential um, uh, treatment or to do some preferential distribution to a section of society is justified only when it is rationally explained. So, the principle of justice requires equal distribution of primary goods among all the members of the society. However, if some deviation has to be there, it must be rationally explained or justified, and why that should be rationally explained is based on the premise that individual is a rational or moral agent, and that requires the theory to be rationally or morally convincing or justifiable. So, as a procedural theory, Rawls pointed out that justice can be achieved through following a just procedure. That is an emphasis on formulating or developing a just theory which will lead to just outcome, and that is a kind of universal approach in his conceptualization of theory as justice, which he modified, for which he also faced many criticism, which we will discuss in the next class. But here we have to understand in this text a theory of justice, his idea of justice as a distributive concept is that it should be based on certain procedure which can be universally applicable without any consideration to a particular context or society. So, the Rawls theory of justice is egalitarian, and he argues that theory of justice should be based on the notion of equality, as we have discussed. So, the Rawls theory is based on an abstract hypothetical idea of original position, which he calls the veil of ignorance. Now, the way we arrive at this principle of justice is based on this hypothetical consideration of individual which Rawls talks about, which he calls original position, where the individual is abstracted from his or her actual social conditions of living and kept in a condition where he is or she is ignorant about his social positions, about his class, about his other personal, individual and collective attributes, and lives in a condition of uncertainties, as they do not know what would be the status if such veil is removed. So, the premise of arriving at this just theory is based on this idea that individual is abstracted from his actual living status to an hypothetical situation which he calls the veil of ignorance. So, people in this original position is ignorant about their social status, position or class or any kind of discrimination that exists in the society. So, in this state of original positions or veil of ignorance, the individual is not aware of his status, his positions, his class or any other discriminations that exist in the society. However, Rawls pointed out that individuals are aware of the basic or the elementary knowledge of economics, psychology and most importantly a sense of justice and other primary goods. Individual in this veil of ignorance, although would not have any particular vision of good life, but they would all be interested in maximizing the primary goods like rights, liberty, power, opportunity, income and other goods that we have discussed. So, in this original position or what Rawls call a veil of ignorance, individual may not be aware of what constitute good life, but they all would be interested in aversing the risk and maximizing the primary goods for the every member in the society. This is so because none of the individual in the state of veil of ignorance would know what would be their actual status in the society when the veil is removed, and therefore fearing that they themselves may end up as worse off sections in the society, they would choose a principle that would maximize the opportunity and good of worse off. So, the idea is that individual in that veil of ignorance are uncertain about their actual condition in the society once the veil of ignorance is removed. Now, if that is done and if they are unsure about their condition in the society, they will devise a mechanism which will benefit or which will maximize the primary goods of those who are the worse off, because they may fear that they themselves may end up as the worse off section in the society. So, the principle of justice argues or require that the individual as a risk averser will develop a mechanism which will be in the benefit of the worse off in the society, and that is the premise in this hypothetical idea of veil of ignorance. So, in this hypothetical situation, the individual would adopt for the least disadvantageous or the least harmful procedure of distribution of goods in the society. So, since Rawls believed that individuals in that state of ignorance have a sense of justice, so they are not like tabula rasa or blank, do not have any idea. So, they do have, even in the veil of ignorance, when they are unaware of their actual status in the society or the discrimination that prevails in the society, yet they have some innate sense of justice or basic economy or the psychology and so on. So, this sense of justice according to Rawls is the source of their moral judgments and motivations. So, this idea of individual being not just a rational person, but also a moral person is very significant, and that moral or a sense of justice is the source of moral judgments and motivation in individual. So, the deliberation on these sets of moral judgments and motivations will lead to what Rawls calls a state of equilibrium. Now, different sets of individual with their sense of morality may not necessarily be automatically will have a same set of moral judgments or moral decisions. These moral judgments or decisions may be at conflict with each other, or different sets of individual will have often contradictory set of moral judgments or decision. Now, in that condition, the moral individual, not just being moral but also rational, will deliberate, will reflect on those moral set of judgments or decisions, and will arrive at a state where there will be a kind of equilibrium, and that equilibrium will remove the inconsistency in the moral decisions or moral judgments. Now, this process of arriving at that condition where the moral set of judgments are through rational deliberation reach a state or lead to a condition where there will be a state of equilibrium, where they will all agree to certain moral general principle that would be a practical guide for the individual. But if there is some specific needs or if there is a requirement for deviation, that should have rational justification as well. So, this process is also called reflective equilibrium. Now, individual in Rawls, he argues that individual thus situated in a state of ignorance and still having an innate sense of justice would arrive at these following two principles of justice. These are also called equality principles or the difference principle of justice, and they are, the first principle talks about, which we call equality principle of justice, that each person should have equal rights to liberty or freedom, and this equal right to liberty and freedom should be maximum for every individual with similar liberty or freedom to others. So, that is the equality freedom, that a state should ensure that everyone should have free and equal rights and liberty to the maximum which is available to the other members in the society. The second principle, which is about difference principle, which talks about social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both benefits to the least well off, or more precisely, if it is in the greatest benefit of the least advantaged sections in the society. The B of this social and economic equalities attached to the offices and job positions are open to all under condition of fair and just equality and opportunity. So, the difference principle talks about two sub principles, where 2A is about if such inequalities in the treatment is to be done, then it should be done on the condition when it benefits the least well off, or more precisely the greatest benefit of the least advantaged sections in the society. The 2B principle talks about that offices and job positions are open to all and not few or selected groups, but to all under the condition of fair or just equality and opportunity. So, the access to job or the public offices are made available on the principle of this fair equality or opportunity, or equality of opportunity and so on. Now, in this principle of justice, it is arranged in a priority wise, and which we call lexical priority. That means, these two principles are arranged in a specific order, which we call the lexical priority. That means, he refers to a specific procedure to be followed for the implementation of these principles. So, these two principles of justice, while following and implementing, must follow certain sequence or certain priorities. These priorities are that the first principle should be implemented before the second. So, the preference or primary emphasis should be given to the first principle that talks about that each person should have equal rights to liberty or freedom with similar liberty to the others. So, a state should ensure that individuals should have equal rights or maximum equal rights to liberty and freedom. The second principle, the 2B, that talks about equal opportunities or fair equality, must come before 2A. So, before the state go for the preferential treatment, state must ensure the free and equal opportunity to offices and job positions. So, thus Rawls talks about a procedural theory of justice with some sequence which we call lexical priority. These principles, if implemented properly, will ensure justice as fairness. So, justice in Rawlsian concept is not certainly is about procedure or just procedure, but it also equally put emphasis on the just outcome, or to create a society which will be a fair society or a egalitarian society or a just society. So, the equality is the basic fundamental social virtue in the Rawlsian conception of justice. Of course, there are many critiques to Rawls which we will discuss. So, in the Rawlsian conception of justice, once again we need to think about some of the things, like it is a distributive concept which talks about distribution of primary goods and not really to determine what is good itself. It should be left for the individual. So, individual has the autonomy to define what is good. The second Rawlsian conception of justice is based on the idea that individual will arrive at this situation when they are abstracted from their actual social condition and put in the veil of ignorance, where they will have a sense of justice, and through that sense of justice they will arrive at certain procedure, certain principle of justice through deliberation, where there will not be any inconsistencies in the moral preferences or moral judgments. And there he talks about these two principles, equality principle which should be always given preference to, and if there is some deviation or some preferential treatment or move away from this equality, then it must be justified only on the grounds when it meets the principle of equal opportunity to job and public offices, and if that is in the benefit or in the greatest benefit of the least disadvantaged sections in the society. So, these are some of the ideas about conception of justice as fairness. On this you can refer to some of these books which is mentioned in this slide. In the next lecture we are going to discuss some of the criticism to John Rawls theory of justice. Then we will pick up different approaches to justice like feminist, communitarian, capability approach and so on. So, that is all for today. Thanks for listening.